Except now I can't. Oh, goodness me. Okay. So this is the first this is the first actual slide from engineering solutions to whole watershed sensibility. Um, yeah. So what the ground I'm going to cover in this presentation, which you'll be pleased to know, is only 12 slides. Especially pleased to know, given that I can't see my notes. This is the ground I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about understanding water resources in our gardens. So, volumes of water involved and where the water might be and how we might use it and turn something that might be considered a problem into a solution, hopefully. I'm going to talk about why we want to have water in containers, which I guess seems sort of self-explanatory, but hopefully it'll be interesting anyway. Why it's advantageous to have rain butts, tanks, and good guttering. I'm going to talk about some calculations so we can work out how much water we might harvest off hard surfaces and roofs, and what that involves. I'm going to talk about thinking beyond just the roofs of our sheds, or our buildings, or our polytunnels, or our greenhouses. I'm going to talk about how, from a more holistic point of view, we need to include soil, water, trees, and earthworks, whatever the size of the landscape we're looking after, in our thinking about water. And then I will conclude with a few words about whole watershed sensibility and what that means and why I think it's important for community gardens, community farms. And my little down arrow has stopped advancing this. Okay. So first of all, gutters, pipes, and rain butts. That's a very fine gutter on the shed in this picture, with a really big downpipe as well. I think that's a excellent bit of over engineering, I think. So guttering takes rain away from walls, windows, and doorways. Which is important. If you've ever stood in a doorway without a gutter over the top of it, or walked under an eave where there's no guttering, you'll know what it's like. But of course, it actually concentrates the flow. So you get all the water off that side of the shed and you concentrate it into one place, which presents a bit of a problem further down the line. And one way of thinking about water systems in our gardens or on our allotments or wherever is to think of it in those terms as a linear system, um, and as an analog really to natural watersheds, to natural water systems. Gardeners love their rain butts and tanks. It's a great conversation, isn't it? Any time of year, with a gardener, a keen gardener, about his rain butt or her rain butt. Um, there's a problem though, which is that rain butts are either empty because it's been dry for a fortnight or a week, or they're overflowing because it's been raining all winter. And that really suggests that the next part of the argument, which is that these elements, our gutters, our pipes, and our rain butts, are only part of a system, and they call for good design. So you can put them all in the right places, but still find that you're overwhelmed either by rain, by constant rainfall, or by a lack of rainfall. The system just doesn't have any resilience. Brian is in the waiting room still. Here we are. So the first step in good observation, sorry, in good design is observation. And I'll probably, if you come to more than one of my presentations, you'll hear me say that many, many times. I think there's probably a knee jerk, a kind of a reflex when people get polytunnels or greenhouses or sheds. We'll just put a rain butt there. Okay, we'll just put a rain butt there. We start a garden. How many rain butts do we need? And I want to suggest that actually that shouldn't be the starting point of our thinking. But we need to start thinking about water resources more widely before we work out how much money we're going to spend on guttering and downpipes. A picture at the top on the right, by the way, is a picture of 1976 for those of you old enough to remember it. So the first thing is local and regional variation, knowing your rainfall where your garden is. There's an area in Essex which has about the same, um, people still coming in, it all. Okay. There's an area in Essex which has about the same rainfall annually as large areas of Morocco. And the difference isn't rainfall. The difference, of course, is evaporation. And I live in I'm lucky enough to live in the west of Cymru, and our rainfall here is a great deal higher. And if you're in the national park in Eryri, you know the rainfall's even higher again. So knowing your local rainfall is really important. You can get the figures online, but there's local variation as well. So counsel of perfection is to have a rain gauge where you're establishing your garden, and ideally to observe rainfall throughout at least 1 year, and then you'll get an idea of the kind of the crude water resources, how much water is falling in the area of your garden. Good observation, of course, of water courses. Um, you think it's quite straightforward, although there might be hidden water courses and there might be seasonal water courses that run for some months of the year. And springs are similar. So you might look at a site and think there are no springs here. Um, and then when it's wet enough, there will be springs. And actually we can, I'll talk a little bit later about perennial plantings and trees, but actually we can make springs and seasonal water courses run more reliably. Once we've got an idea of how much water falls on our gardens and what watercourses and springs we might have, we can start observing hopefully occasional phenomena like visible surface runoff. Ryan coming back in. Um, Visible surface runoff. So when we have heavy rain events, watching where the water flows. Quite often, certainly where I live, we get visible surface runoff on tracks and paths. Talk a little bit about that later. Some places you get visible surface runoff going straight across fields. It's often where conventional farming has essentially destroyed soil structure, and you have high levels of compaction. And you might be taking over a bit of ground for your garden where you have high levels of compaction, and you'll see visible surface runoff, or waterlogging. I was looking at some waterlogging in a field just the other day where a tractor had got stuck in the past. I don't know how long ago, actually, long enough that rushes had started growing there, but the tractor had made big wheel ruts and essentially created a level of such compaction that there was waterlogging. Um, this spring, this March, years afterwards. And you might get waterlogging in gateways or on tracks, or at low-lying areas of your garden. There's a lot we can do to improve waterlogging. And interestingly enough, the solutions for waterlogging are very similar to the solutions for drought. Which brings me on to observations of the soil. So getting to know your soil is a really important part of understanding water resources. Wendy's coming in again. Um, Observing your soil is a really important part of understanding your water resources. So there is a difference between having, as you will all know, free draining sandy soil, and a clay loam, or a compacted heavy clay soil. These are going to make huge amounts of difference to your water resources, to the way water behaves on your site. And it makes a mockery of averages, of figures, of all-encompassing prescriptions, because every place that you go to will have different kinds of soil that behaves differently under different conditions, different rainfall, different drought conditions, and observing your plants. Um, how they grow might be a key to where water is and where water isn't, when they wilt, when the leaves yellow and fall. All of these things are good keys, or good clues to when we have water shortages or water abundance and where on our sites. So good observation. Oh, went to, I go to, yes. I'm sorry, I can't click through these anymore. Um, Okay, so aiming for resilience in the long term. If you're not familiar with Yeoman's keyline scale of permanence, it's a way of looking at what we can change most easily in our gardens, on our farms, or in our landscapes. And you'll notice that something which is um, relatively short term, but relatively easy to change down the bottom left is considered to be soil, because we can, with soil amendments and soil treatments, and cultivation, we can change soil, well, for the better or the worse, actually. And if you follow the scale of permanence all the way up, you'll notice that water is quite high up, but all of these steps can actually change all of the steps above. And so we work our way up, influencing the things we can, doing what we can on a site, in a garden, on a farm, and eventually, through influencing soil and all of the other factors there, we will change in the long term the water resources on a site. Again, this shows you the rather limited nature of just thinking about water butts. No, it doesn't matter which arrow I press. I can't go on to the next slide without using the mouse. So, having said all of that, all those caveats about requiring more holistic, longer term, landscape wide thinking, there are still advantages of good rainwater harvesting systems. If we want to water tunnels that we've just put up, or we want to water greenhouses or containers or potting benches, then we need reliable water supply. None of these things are ideally watered from the mains. Um, Rainwater is better in all of these cases. And so I think it's arguable that rainwater harvesting, as it's normally understood, like into tanks in the right-hand picture, or rain butts on a smaller scale off your shed, or a series of rain butts, if you're lucky to have someone who's handy and can plumb all your rain butts together, might be considered absolutely essential. I think there's a counter argument, but we can get into that later. I think that potentially you can design protected cropping not to require rain butts or conventional rainwater harvesting, but yeah, we can talk about that later if anyone's interested. So the second advantage of good rainwater harvesting systems is directly productive uses. We might be able to use our harvested rainwater, for example, uh, in aquaculture for growing watercress, or we might want to experiment with growing reed mace or other experimental crops. There's a whole range of aquaculture crops which are radically underused in our gardens. Um, I mean, we could actually use rainwater resources to do aquaponics as well. If anyone is interested in aquaponics, that can be driven with a rainwater system. Um, yeah, so this idea of designing greenhouses from water outwards struck me earlier. I think what normally happens is we think, wow, we've got money for a greenhouse or we've got money for a polytunnel. We bang it up and then we hack on our rainwater harvesting almost as an afterthought, to the extent that we've got the cash for a tank or we've got the cash for gutters. And I wonder what it would be like if instead we designed our protected cropping, our greenhouses and our tunnels water first. So if any of you have ever been into a Victorian greenhouse with a cistern underneath, the cistern was absolutely integral to the greenhouse design. Not only does it mean that the whole greenhouse is harvesting water for the cistern all year round, but also that cistern is cooled by being underneath the greenhouse. It's under the ground essentially, and it changes the microclimate in the greenhouse. So, as is often the case when we design things well, we get multiple benefits. So, if you're storing water inside a greenhouse or a polytunnel in a large tank underneath it, in the case of a cistern, that water will cool the protected cropping area in the summer and make it frost-proof in the winter, because that's how large bodies of water work. So I wonder if we turned our design priorities around, a little bit like designing a house from the wood burner or the hearth outwards, rather than adding the wood burner and the hearth as a last measure. I wonder if we turned our design thinking around in terms of polytunnels and greenhouses, we might come up with some interesting multiple benefits from harvesting and storing water. Um, Doing your calculations for rainwater harvesting, I've got some really good notes on this one underneath that I can't see. Um, so calculate your roof areas. You calculate roof areas flat. So it's not complicated. All you need to do is to walk the length and the width of your building and calculate it in meters squared. If you've done the advisable thing and worked out how many of your paces go into, oh, Helen's back. How many of your paces go into 25 meters or 50 meters, and then you can calculate the length of your pace and never need to carry a landscape measure with you again. So you calculate your roof area in Brian's back as well. They are being very persistent. Um, Fair play. Um, so you can calculate your roof area very easily in terms of meters squared. And then you know your annual rainfall, as discussed earlier, in millimeters. And nowadays, really, you should take into account that climate change is going to throw those figures off, probably very radically from year to year. 40%, I think, is the figure that the SUDS people, the sustainable drainage people, work on. I think that's probably quite conservative, actually, given what we're likely to see in the years to come. So you have your roof area in meters squared, you have your annual rainfall in millimeters, and then you multiply your meters squared by your millimeters and by something called the roofing or the roof coefficient, which is the efficiency with which your roof sheds water. So some roofs will shed water more readily than others. Normally, it's quite safe to work on the basis that your roof coefficient is 0.9. In other words, 90% of the water that falls on your roof will end up in your rainwater harvesting system. So that's meters squared times millimeters of rainfall times your roofing coefficient, and that gives you a figure in liters. Most rainwater harvesting companies will then advise you to size your tanks at 3 times the amount that you can harvest, right? That you will harvest in one go, right? Um, I I I'm uncertain about this to say the least, because the problem is that very quickly, certainly here, you got more rainwater than you can reasonably several times of the year, really, in this part of the world anyway. You got more rainwater than you can reasonably store in an affordable tank. I live in a 15-meter by 6-meter cabin, and it works out at 90,000 liters of water a year. That's a really big set of tanks, right? So you really need to work out how much you use and where it's going. And I'll come back to both those questions in a moment. It's also really important to understand rainfall distribution through the year. Um, this goes hand in hand with understanding the difference of evaporation through the year. So there are times when rainfall will evaporate faster than others, obviously when it's hot. Um, it's quite interesting to look at rainfall distribution through the year for Cymru, at least, because the rainfall distribution is quite even. People do talk about spring droughts, but actually it's a minimal effect in most years. So most years we get the same rain in the summer as we get in the winter. It's just that it evaporates faster in the summer. Interesting, this question of when rain is falling and when it's evaporating is also important if you're practicing mulching in your garden or in your polytunnels or greenhouses. You don't want to mulch when the soil is dry because rain will then fall on your mulch and be excluded from the soil and will evaporate from mulch before it reaches the soil. You really want to mulch after the soil has been rained on and before it starts to evaporate. So good luck with that timing, with juggling that timing. But it is a really important issue in terms of putting down mulch and therefore reducing your need to water, which I'll come to again in a little while. Have an idea of how much water you will use. You can do this in a really haphazard way by working out how many of your rain butts or your IBCs you empty in a week, watering your polytunnel or your greenhouse. Um, or you can look at DEFRA figures. DEFRA provides figures on use of irrigation water in protected cropping. I think the problem with those figures, as I mentioned earlier, is it's going to vary enormously from site to site. It also varies enormously from crop to crop. So lettuce on a free draining soil will be much more greedy of water than um, I don't know, something that doesn't need as much water on a good loam. So yeah, sizing your tanks then is related to all of these things, how much you use and rainfall distribution. You size your tanks to see yourself through the longest expected dry spell. And you can look over rainfall figures for your site, for your region. If you're lucky, you've got garden figures because somebody has obsessively kept a rain gauge in your garden going back years and years. Um, and that's the kind of really valuable knowledge that we can leave to our successors in garden projects, by the way. So you look at what your longest expected dry spell is, how much you use, and that is your best guide to how much you need in terms of tank. Buying tanks is not a luxury, right? Buying water tanks, go for the biggest set of tanks you can buy. Um, it's a no-brainer. Uh, oh, I'll skip down two. So, rain gardens and wildlife ponds from overflows. I talked a little bit about where the water goes if your rain butts overflow. If you underestimate or undersize your tank system, well, you just don't have a choice because you can't afford bigger tanks. The water goes, overflows. It's great to have an overflow into a wildlife pond or into a rain garden, which is essentially a way of slowing the water down and infiltrating it into the soil. In terms of long-term site water resources, infiltration is is what we're looking for. So that's the disadvantage of lined ponds as opposed to unlined ponds, which promote infiltration. Both rain gardens and wildlife ponds can be really important for biodiversity. It's a great way to use water that otherwise would just make people curse every time they walked over a bit of ground near the overflowing water butts. Oh, next slide. Okay, so where is the best place to store water? Um, Not rain butts or tanks, both of which are made of plastic, after all, neither of which last forever, like guttering. If we're talking about long-term resilience for our sites, if we're talking about multi-generational thinking, the well-being of future generations, then the best water store we have is the soil. If you look at that table, that chart on the left there, and imagine you have a nice clay loam where you garden. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a mouthful of water. Okay, nice clay loam. Volume of soil water which is available to plants on a nice clay loam there is around about 20%, I would say, roughly reading that chart. So that means that in a cubic meter of ground of good soil, which I know isn't a meter deep because you'd be lucky to have good clay loam a meter deep, but a cubic meter of good clay loam then can hold 200 liters. So over a hectare, it's an absolutely vast amount of available water available to plants. And bear in mind, your plants may wilt as a response to hot, drying weather in order to protect themselves, but they won't suffer a terminal wilt and die until there is no available water, until all of that available water has gone. So, how do we improve our best water store? And I guess we all know because we're all gardeners, but at the risk of stating the obvious, let's revise it. We increase soil life. Soil life creates good soil structure and gives us that couscous looking soil structure we're all after. And that soil structure has an enormous, an incalculable surface area. And on every surface, water is held. We can't match this kind of efficiency, right? Doesn't matter how clever we are with gutters, pipes, tanks, rain butts, we can't match this kind of efficiency. So we should be using deep rooting green manures to increase life, to help increase life in the soil, because of course we know the relationship between plants, living roots, and good soil life. We should be using perennial plantings, not necessarily everywhere, but widely. We should be adding organic matter, which could be chopped and dropped from those perennial plantings. We should be using polycultures and or and or rotations. Both polycultures and rotations. One is a rotation in space, one is a rotation in time, and they can be combined. Both increase soil life, biodiversity in the soil. We increase soil life, we increase the soil's capacity to hold water. The key is living soil. Anyone who's not familiar with the work of an American farmer by the name of Gabe Brown should go and look his work up. In particular, the comparisons between the waterlogged fields of his neighbors and his free draining fields. Free draining but spongy. So they hold at just enough and they let go of more than, when there's more than enough. So the use of mulches, I've talked about timed mulches to retain soil moisture, either from free materials, from materials we can grow on site, which then also increase organic matter in the soil, or commercial alternatives. So starch mulch, for example, or paper mulches that can be bought in. All these used properly can reduce the need to water. And I think that's the response that we should always have when we're thinking about a new garden or an established garden. How are we going to water? No. Rewind. How are we going to reduce the need to water? Okay, that's where we should start. And that's the first principle. Okay, so after soil and linked to soil inextricably, the role of trees in the landscape. So we know that plant roots increase soil infiltration and the increases of water infiltration into the soil par excellence are trees. Um, Planting trees increases the sponginess of soil. In fact, it increases the sponginess of all landscapes. So if we're really looking for a strategy to improve our watersheds, which is something I'll get back to you later, we should be planting trees on every ridge, on every steep slope, on every hilltop. The accumulation of leaf litter and wind-blown organic matter under trees and under hedges increases soil sponginess. So everywhere you have trees, even little trees, everywhere you have hedges, you're making sponges. And those sponges um, are increasing your site's resilience in the face of both flood and drought. When we come to a garden or when we look at a garden, one of the first things we should consider and one of the first crucial questions to ask about limiting factors for growing on the site is the presence or absence of windbreaks. The trees, well-designed windbreaks of trees or smaller plants, if we're talking about gardening really small areas, are essential in most places. And windbreaks don't only improve the microclimate by allowing places to warm up or to be out of a chill wind. Of course, they reduce evaporation. So windbreaks reduce the need to water. They're spongy, they increase infiltration, and they reduce evaporation for meters and meters out into the garden. Really, and I make this argument again and again, so excuse me if you've heard me say this before, we must garden and farm as if we're in woodland clearings, and we must create those clearings. And that's the best way to reduce profligate use of water and to cut down on how many rain butts and tanks and gutters and whatever else we need. I'm not even going to mention boreholes. We can have a discussion about why not later on. Okay, so this is related to both questions of soil and trees. Earthworks. We can shape the ground to increase water infiltration and long-term water resources. And we can do this even on small gardens. So unlined ponds, increasing infiltration of soil into the ground, is a really good idea. People tend to look at ponds and oh no, that pond's only half full. Well, it's actually infiltrating water into the soil in a really helpful way. And in the winter, or whenever you get heavy rains, it will fill up again. Swales are like ditches on contour. Um, so they don't drain the water away like a ditch does. Somebody who somebody who's worked in farming will correct me, but I think ditches run at 1 in 40, whereas swales are on contour. So as they fill, they become areas of infiltration. Patrick Whitfield used to say that swales are temporary structures in the landscape because normally on a swale bank you plant trees. What that means is this marvelous area where water collects when it's wet and then infiltrates, fills with leaf litter and organic matter, and eventually just becomes an extra deep sponge in the landscape. So they are temporary in a way. They fill up with organic matter and they become spongy. Terraces for holding water and for holding nutrients. Also for ease, if you're working on steep slopes, are a strategy at older gardens. Um, and can be used on any scale, really. This is a cool climate terrace system here. What lovely walls. I mean, that must be quite expensive to set up a terrace like that. You don't need to set them up with nice masonry like that. Interception banks, you would normally have in this picture of terraces, the little lip on the walls at the front works as an interception bank, so that if you were ever to get runoff or surface water on the terrace, it would be stopped by the interception bank and forced to infiltrate. On larger terraces, interception banks can be like earth banks, earth bunds. And my personal bugbear, paths that are at 90 degrees to contour. We know that water runs at 90 degrees to contour. So any path which runs steeply down a hill um, shows really bad or complete absence of design. Paths should go close to contour. And if you look at that serpentine path going down that meadow, it presents a much easier way to climb the hill as well. But also, it presents opportunities on the bends to collect any runoff that you do get, to steer it off the bends of the paths into rain gardens or ponds or swales or tree plantings or perennial plantings. This is a strategy that, can be used even in the smallest garden with the most gentle slope. I also wanted to mention drains on paths. So you can put in those forestry drains, or if you really have no other option, those metal top plastic drains to carry water off a path rather than allowing water to damage your paths. Oops. So, towards a whole watershed sensibility, instead of starting with rain butts and taps and boreholes, heaven help us, if we start with our soil and increasing the sponginess of our site using techniques like mulching or or shading even, or windbreaks to reduce the need for watering first. Before we ask how much water do we need, let's ask how do we reduce the need to water. Um, and then only after that use appropriate scale technology, plastics and money, um, then we can move towards a shared responsibility for whole watersheds. In other words, we need to have a look at the landscape, what our neighbours are doing, and where our water goes, um, and share that responsibility and develop watershed-wide conversations. I think this should come naturally to people planning and running community gardens and community farms as a way of building the wider community, um, and building wider resilience. Yeah, I think that's it. I've probably forgotten half my notes, so I'm going to stop sharing now. Any questions or comments or arguments or brickbats or whatever you like? Somebody's muted, I think. Maybe you're all muted. Do we have to unmute people? Can you unmute yourselves?
People should be able to unmute themselves. In the participants bit, I've given everybody the ability to unmute themselves.
Okay. So if you have anything to say, please unmute yourself. And I'm not chairing as
Hi,
well. My
I
mouth is
have a
very dry.
question.
Yes.
So I actually work on a site where we're already doing like a forest garden,
Yes.
which is very lucky to already have that. But part of the site is actually having the opposite problem where we've got too much water. We've got really clay soil, loads of trees, and then we've got an area where we've terraced it as well, and it's just collecting water there. So what do we do to improve that kind of woodland clay soil? Because we're already getting the leaf litter, but like it's walked on a lot, so it's quite hard to figure out how to help that environment.
Yeah. Well, the first rule of being a designer anyway is never to design remotely without seeing the site. So I'm not going to say, "Oh, I know
Okay.
what you must, I know what you must do."
Cool.
Um, but I think in general, I think if the problem to me doesn't sound like the water, the problem to me sounds like the traffic. um, eventually what will happen is those trees will build up and build up and build up, and that sponge could be of use to you. The sponge that they're creating could be of use to you. And I think where it's a permaculture dictum, right? No one will be surprised to hear me say, turn your problem into solutions, turn your problems into solutions. So it seems to me like it's probably an area where you could be growing fast growing trees that you can then chop and drop and use to accelerate carbon cycles and improve soil across the site. Um, I'm very much a fan of high biomass willow. I'm also a real fan of alder. And anyone you know who likes dyeing, alder is a good dyeing plant. Yeah. So that would be, there's no I don't look at land like farmers did in the 20th century and say, "Oh, that's wet, we must drain it." In fact, I look at land that's wet and think, "Wow, that's great, that's a resource." But I can't design remotely. I
No,
guess
of course.
the problem is the traffic.
Mm.
Is there a way you can untraffic it?
Mm, tricky.
Ra
Unless,
Raised walkway, maybe?
yeah, yeah,
That's
Can I
expensive.
just
possibility.
interject there? I've got wet areas with paths on, and my paths have always become a bit of a sludge pit. But recently I've started experimenting with putting down discarded wool. Where I live, there's a lot of
Oh,
wool produced that nobody wants. So I get bales and bales of wool for nothing. And that's shocking. But anyway, they've got to get rid of it. And I put it down and then put wood chip on top, and it creates a kind of almost a floating path. I know that sounds insane, but it
Wow.
does work. And they've started using it in like paths in the mountains as well to protect the
Fantastic.
ground. But
As I was
sorry
saying,
to like butt in
no,
there. I
no,
can see
that's really
Caroline and Simon have both got
that's
questions.
That's really useful, Sarah. Actually, me mentioning Gabe Brown earlier, please go and watch the Gabe Brown videos. There's an astonishing comparison between a field of Gabe Brown's where he's concentrated on building soil life and a neighbour's field which is entirely flooded on the other side of the road, same rainfall, and he goes on his ground with big tractors, like he's an American farmer, enormous tractors, a couple of days after the rain when there are still ducks swimming in standing water on his neighbour's farm. And so it seems like that kind of problem, and that fits in with what Sarah was saying, I think. Build up organic matter. Build up organic matter, yeah. Who's next? Clemence or Caroline?
I can go, yeah. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. I've got two questions. One is on growing in raised bed because it's the first time we've been growing in raised bed, so the soil is a bit different, like the way you build soil, I like, and the relation to soil. And so I've noticed, so this year, like this winter, there were like big puddles, and because the raised bed are like built on like half soil area and half like hard surface, and I was just
Okay.
like, oh, I'm not sure what to do with that. So that's one question. And the other question is about biochar, the use of biochar to retain water. Is that something that you would like?
Yeah, biochar is difficult to. I think the problem with the water in your raised beds, the standing water in your raised beds, they they're unable to drain out of the bottom because of the hard standing. Is that
No, because no, not really, because they actually drain and the water it actually leaks, and you see like
Oh, okay.
I was seeing like algae even uh like so
Yes.
you see like the nutrient running away, and I was just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I
So
just don't.
if you've got the potential to plant where you're seeing that water run,
It's
then
what I was thinking.
you can catch the nutrients. So
Hmm.
comfrey would be the classic, but it wouldn't be enough in the winter, right? Because the comfrey wouldn't be visible in the winter. But if you put a nice perennial planting there
Hmm.
with enough of a net, then you'll catch those nutrients or a
Hmm.
large quantity of them. It's just
Hmm.
that question putting in what do they call it along rivers, a buffer zone to catch the nutrients to stop the runoff. If you've got the
Yeah.
potential to do that, I think that would be the way to do it. With regard to biochar, really interesting. The reason I think, might be wrong, chemists in the room might, or biochemists might put me right. I think the reason biochar works in terms of water retention in the soil is because biochar increases soil life. And the thing about biochar is the surface area, right? So it's full of niches for your um for your microbial soil life and all of the things, all the nematodes and everything that eats the microbes and all the fungal strands and everything. And all of that is essentially a net for holding on to water. So yeah, I think biochar is very effective in that regard because it increases soil life. I don't think it's a silver bullet. I think there are other ways to do it. But yeah, it's the massive increase in surface area. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Caroline, is it?
Yeah, yes. Hello. Really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I'm embarrassed to say I've not come across swales before, which seems to be a terrible gap in my education. So can you talk to me just for a sentence or two, or tell me where to look up about swales, about the difference between a swale and a pond? So I'm thinking about a gently sloping allotment on heavy clay. And I was thinking about putting a pond at the bottom, and now I'm thinking, oh, a swale instead. But
Swales are great. I mean, they are generally speaking a dry land strategy, because in dry lands you quite often get surface runoff after heavy rains. Where you don't get surface runoff, arguably, swales aren't called for, but instead linear on contour planting, because that increases infiltration in the same way that swales do. But if you're interested in swales, lots of work's been done on swales in Australia, dry landscapes. P.A. Yeomans is the famous man for using swales on a farm scale, ensuring Australian farmers against drought. There are some really interesting swales in the American Southwest that were put in during the Great Depression, on one of like the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of Roosevelt's New Deal bodies, put in swales in the in the American Southwest, Arizona or somewhere, New Mexico, and they're still there and they're covered in trees, and all around the landscape is desiccated. But the swales are covered in trees, and they never planted them. They dug them and they walked away. So really a dryland strategy, but on a steep slope, or where it's going to take a while or be difficult to establish those linear plantings, swales can be useful. And of course, they give you that potential to grow semi-aquatics or wetland plants, because inevitably, if you dig into a slope and there's water running down underneath the surface, it'll be interrupted, it'll be intercepted by the swale. And then you can grow nice things like you could always grow comfrey or willows on the swale bank. But yeah, swale is essentially a ditch that's got a bit lost It's a ditch that's not going downhill on contour, which is a really nice exercise actually in community gardens or on community farms. You get people out with an A-frame, marking out contours, and marking out contours is bound to surprise you. I'm never cease to be amazed by how difficult it is to spot contours by eye. You start marking them out with an A-frame. It's like, oh wow, this is the way the contour goes. It's quite good fun.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Anyone else? Anyone got any experience that runs directly counter to mine? Because I'd love to hear it, and then I'll make a note. No? Anyone? Oh, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul, just a quickie. You've mentioned one or two practitioners in the US of A. Brad Lancaster, are you familiar with his work out there?
Ooh, I've heard the name, but I can't think what he's involved in. Do tell me, Brian.
The little I know is he's in very, very dry semi-desert areas, focused in a big town. It's mostly the things you've already covered, Paul, but he's done it on a very extensive scale in the area that he's in and had terrific results that the local authority has really, really appreciated. It can be easily found on YouTube. I've personally found his explanations be very, very easy to follow and understand.
Right.
And he demonstrates what he's saying with models. It doesn't just take you out on the landscape, but it kind of explains the science and the practicalities of it all as well. So it's just something I'd want to recommend.
Brad Lancaster. I've made a note. I should probably add a man called Andrew Millison to that American list, who is a lecturer at Oregon State. Very interesting on water in the landscape. Wendy, I think.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited also by these swales because I'm wondering whether we might have an old swale that nobody realised about. We have a dew pond. We're in Chilterns, and there's a dew pond that hasn't had water for a long, long time. And a distance away from the dew pond is a very steep, flinty slope, and the water runs down exceedingly fast down this slope. And currently we veer it off into a sort of pit on the other side. But we've always thought, wouldn't it be lovely if we could redirect it across the field into the pond that isn't a pond anymore? So yes, that's really quite an exciting thought, that we could measure up the contours with our young people that come here and do that. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask as well, how long, if you've got water in a water butt, how long does it remain good for using with plants? I'm just thinking we've got some very full. Thank you.
So your water butts. So no. I'm whereabouts in the Chilterns are you? I'm a Bucks lad by birth.
Near Great Missenden.
Oh, there we are. Okay, I went to school in Aylesbury, so I know the Flint landscape. We were always up in the woods playing near Wendover and places like that. So if you might find that earthwork would fill the pond by infiltration. And one of the really interesting things that I've noticed with growing on contour, if you lay out beds on contour or ridges for potatoes, and then you get a lot of rain and those dips fill, you can actually create springs very quickly and fill up downhill water features.
Wow.
Quite astonishing. Yeah, I've quite inadvertently created springs in vegetable gardens by cultivation on contour, by cultivating potatoes on contour. Yeah. And rain butts. Yeah, this is really important actually, Wendy. Thank you for reminding me. I should have said rain. I'm a big fan of drinking rainwater as well. So, to give you all a heads up, it's a whole other conversation. But I heartily recommend. I'm not going to heartily recommend drinking rainwater because I get in trouble with social farms and gardens. I heartily recommend essential rainwater harvesting by Verge Permaculture. They worked with an Australian academic, and 7 million people in Australia are on domestic rainwater systems. So yes, your tanks and your rain butts will be fine as long as it remains what's called a hungry environment. So don't let organic matter into your rain butts or your tanks. That's how you get stagnant water. So that's why on some really good rainwater systems and on sheds and things like that, you'll see mechanical filters over the top of downpipes or over the top of rain butts or tanks to stop leaves and organic matter getting in. Ideally, what you want on the insides of your rain butts and your water tanks is a biofilm. You actually want life in your tanks, but you want it to be a hungry biofilm that will take out any pathogens that do appear. You don't want leaves accumulating in the bottom. That's what will make it stagnant. So a lid, mechanical filter if you get leaves on the roof, and then you'll be fine. The water will, as long as it's a hungry environment, it will never go stagnant. And there are ancient cisterns that prove this. I mean, there are 19th century stone and lime rendered cisterns in the States that have never gone stagnant, you know. And then there's obviously in West Asia, you've got all the Arab and Byzantine cisterns with water in. As long as they remain a hungry environment, you're fine.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to
Lisa.
ask about that as well, Paul, because I've recently, about 6 months ago, set up a big IBC, one of the standard IBCs in a cage on my allotment. And when I was over there earlier, I noticed the water had started going green. Now, how green is it good for it to go? And after Googling it, it seems the advice is to cover it in something black to stop the sunlight. So is that generally a good thing to do if you've got a clearish or an opaque water tank?
Yeah, I don't mind the algae on my IBCs. They do, but there are dark IBCs. Generally speaking, like I was saying, if there are no extra nutrients in there, I guess there would be a slow buildup of nutrients from algae present on the inside, if it's present on the inside. But it would be very, very slow. But yeah, if you darken a tank and the tank warms up and cools, you get this convection current inside the tank. And the convection current actually brings the water into contact with your biofilms. Um, and then the biofilm munches on any pathogens in the water. It's interesting that they've done experiments with water quality from rainwater harvesting systems, and the water quality is higher in rainwater harvesting systems where no one ever cleans out the gutters. Because the moment you start cleaning, you destroy the biofilms that keep the water high quality, alive, essentially. Yeah, really
Yeah.
fascinating stuff. I think
And
it's
I've actually found you can put it says you can cover it with a black plastic sheet, but if you're willing to spend a bit of money, they actually do black IBC covers which
they
fit
do.
perfectly with the holes, which I didn't
Yeah,
realize
yeah.
even existed before today.
No, that's great. I think that's probably the way to go. Experiment.
Yeah.
That's gone 5 o'clock, everyone. So I should say thank you very much for coming and putting up with me for an hour or 50 minutes. I'm sorry I lost my notes. So yeah, unless anyone's got any parting comments, I think that's it. We're done.
Thanks
Thank
very
you so
much,
much for
Paul.
coming.
I just wanted to ask you, have you got a website or publication that you'd recommend on this? I'm at the very starting out part of the process, and would
Yeah.
like to
Well,
get this set up, right, rather
if
than
anyone
having to
if anyone wants any
fix it
further
later.
resources on water, yeah. Sorry, Helen, I cut across you. If
No,
anyone
it's
wants
okay.
further resources on water, then feel free to email me at paul@farmgarden.org.uk, and I'll put together a resources list.
Thank you. Apparently, according to the Old Wales maps, there is a well on my field, and I don't know where it is. And I don't know where to
Fortunately,
find it. Where do I start?
fortunately, there's so much water comes out of the sky in Cymru that you're not going to be short.
Oh, that's
Okay,
good.
well, diolch yn fawr iawn, everybody. Have a nice
Diolch.
evening.
Thank you. Diolch.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I'll start.
Diolch.